Hello there everyone, welcome to the Drydock episode 336. This week the questions are taken from Guide 410 on the Orion class, the Wednesday video on battle carpentry, and the Friday video on French interwar cruisers and how they were both the best and the worst of the heavy cruiser designs of that time. So let's get on with questions. Vicky asks, when attacking moving ships with high-altitude level bombers, such as the US and RAF were both so fond of doing against enemy capital ships, wouldn't it be more effective to drop aerial mines in the enemy ships' paths rather than try to hit them with conventional bombs? With a conventional bomb, all the targeted ship has to do is change course so that the bombs hit the sea instead of the ship, or ideally also don't hit the sea too close to the ship, but then you're good to go. Whereas with aerial mines, not only does the targeted ship have to dodge the falling mine, but they and anyone else who's following it now have to continue to avoid the spot where it came down, theoretically allowing high-altitude bombers to force an enemy fleet to choose between steaming into a disadvantageous formation or direction, or hitting mines. In theory, yes, this would be more effective for all the reasons you mentioned. The main problems with the idea, however, are that mines, when you look at the average sea mine, are not particularly aerodynamic shapes, so they'd be even less accurate than the conventional bombs that the level bombers were using. The other problem is that obviously you'd want to go with a fairly simple mine, so probably a contact detonation fuse, and, well, chucking it out of an aircraft and having it plummet several thousand feet straight into the sea is a good way to get it to set itself off or to break the fusing before it can actually, affect a ship. There are potential solutions to that problem, most notably the use of a parachute to obviously slow the mine down so it doesn't take as much damage as it would otherwise just slamming into the ocean. Because the other thing you've got to remember is obviously mines tend to be very, very much heavy on the explosive and less so much on the casing compared to bombs. And the Germans were quite notorious throughout World War II for the use of parachute mines launched from aircraft into the sea, both off the British coast initially when they were trying to cause problems for British shipping, and then also they tried to use them off the Normandy coast during the D-Day invasions. However, obviously, if you drop a big mine by parachute, it's going to take a lot longer to fall, which means you have to drop considerably further ahead of the target in question. And at that point, both the distance and the fact that they're going, oh, look, I can see a very slowly descending parachute mine, makes evasion an awful lot easier. It might still have a formation disrupting effect for fleets or for perhaps things like convoys, and you could in theory minimize the weight and space requirements by perhaps just going with purely floating mines and just forget the whole anchoring system and have them perhaps on a 24-48 hour timer as well. So you drop them, it forces disruption in the immediate event, but a day or two later they're just bobbing around quite happily, and then they just detonate because the chances of them being effective at that point are fairly little use. Of course, later on in the war, B-29s and such also dropped parachute mines off of the Japanese coast to great effect, although obviously they weren't dropping them against specific ships, they were dropping them as general minefields. The sort of circle to that particular square of problems was actually developed by the British in the form of something I've mentioned before, the B-bomb, or buoyancy bomb, and that was effectively a 250-pound high-explosive bomb, although there were designs for larger versions as well, with the exception that it had a buoyancy chamber and a delayed activating fuse aboard. And the idea was very similar to what you described. You drop the bomb in the path of an enemy ship rather than trying to hit the enemy ship. And ideally you would drop a whole stick of them, hence why the 250-pounder was the first one developed. And the idea of those was that obviously being built with the strength of a bomb, you didn't need to worry about parachutes and everything, so you could drop them relatively close and they'd fall relatively quickly, so difficult to evade. They'd then hit the water, their momentum would carry them down, but then the buoyancy present would bring them back up again underneath, theoretically, an enemy ship, where they would then detonate. Or if they were dropped a bit too far forward, they'd pop up and kind of float around like a very, very small mine, and then potentially hit the sides of the enemy ship as the enemy ship swept past, and the current of the ship passing through would have potentially sucked them against the side of the enemy ship, and then after a while the buoyancy chamber would fill up and they'd sink out of sight. So it was an option, and personally I think, yeah, the general concept, especially with something like the buoyancy bomb, probably would have worked a lot more effectively than level bombing. Honestly, at this point in my research into it, I'm not entirely sure why the British didn't end up deploying the buoyancy bomb. Well, it seems they didn't deploy it at all, or very, very rarely, which is slightly confusing to me because, as I said, you know, the number of times level bombing was used on various German and other warships, given the relatively scarce number of hits, buoyancy bombs probably would have been considerably more effective. Willpat asks, when the Iowas fired the Mark 13 1900-pound HC shell, it had a shorter range than the 2700-pound AP shell. Can you explain why? Because shouldn't a much lighter shell, fired with the same powder charge, have a longer range? The odd thing is the same HC shell had a longer range over the same AP shell when fired by the North Carolinas and South Dakotas. Why would it be the opposite between different guns? Additionally, the 2240-pound Mark 147 extended range HC shell that was being worked on was heavier than the old Mark 13. Why would being heavier help it have a longer range? There's a few different factors in play, but when it comes to the difference between the 1650 and the 1645 caliber guns, that appears to be simply the fact that the 50 caliber gun, by having that extra 5 calibers, is able to continue to accelerate the armor-piercing projectile, the Mark 8, for longer and get it up to a considerably higher muzzle velocity, because of course there's more inertia to overcome, so you know that pressure of the expanding gases, if you give it more room, will continue to push faster and faster. Whereas the Mark 13, the HC shell, appears to have been reaching almost about as quick as you were going to get with that particular propellant base and shell weight combination, because if you look at the muzzle velocity for the Mark 8 from the South Dakota and North Carolina's guns compared to coming out of the Iowa's guns, the Mark 8 is going dramatically quicker out of the 16-inch 50. But if you look at the Mark 13, although it is going slightly quicker, it's not going anywhere near as much faster coming out of the Iowa's guns compared to the South Dakotas and North Carolinas. And therefore, the proportional increase in kinetic energy at the start of flight for the Mark 8 is much, much greater than for the Mark 13 when you're firing it out of a 16-inch 50 as opposed to 16-inch 45. So that's part of the reason. Now, in terms of the rest of it, why with the Iowas the HC shell goes less far compared to the AP shell, and also why the extended range shell would go further, it's all tied into the same thing. So there are two elements to it. The basic one is that even if you had two identical profile shells, as the shell flies through the air, it's going to be subject to air resistance, and a heavier shell therefore will retain more inertia as it travels through the air as compared to a lighter shell with the same overall surface area. So even if you start off going particularly quickly, but somewhat faster perhaps, in the case of the HC shell, you will lose velocity much, much quicker, and obviously therefore at some point the Mark 8 shell will start to be the faster shell and with more energy it will just keep going further and further. So an extreme example for consideration might be the fact that if you pick up a golf ball and you just overarm throw it, you can get it to go quite a considerable distance. Whereas if you take a table tennis ball or a ping pong ball, depending on where you're from, what it might be called, it's about the same size as a golf ball, but it's much, much, much lighter because it's just hollow plastic. And if you throw it at the same velocity with the same force from the same overarm throw, if you're doing it with any great enthusiasm, the golf ball will go a lot further than the ping pong ball. And in fact, even if you put that same ping pong ball into an air cannon, if you've got a decent throwing arm, you can throw that golf ball a lot further than the ping pong ball will go, even from a high pressure air cannon, because air resistance will very rapidly slow down that much lighter projectile. And the same thing, although obviously on a slightly closer scale, is happening with the Mark 8 and the Mark 13. But there is one other factor to consider with this specific comparison, which is why this picture is up here, and that is the aerodynamic profile of the two shells. Now, if you look at the Mark 13, you'll notice that its main body, the cylindrical part of the shell, is considerably shorter than the cylindrical section of the Mark 8. And then the Mark 13 has this extended nose cap. Now, there would be a fuse on the front, which would make it pointy, but that is the flight profile, relatively short body, and overall a slightly shorter shell than the Mark 8 when you take into account the windshield that goes on the Mark 8. So the Mark 8 has a longer profile, so that makes it better for slipping through the air. It's a more aerodynamic form. And with the addition of that windshield, the nose is very much longer and more tapered, which again is better for pushing through the air at high speeds, at least the kind of speed regiments you're talking about for these shells. And so purely from an aerodynamic perspective, the Mark 8 shell has better aerodynamics, and therefore even if they were of the same weight and were fired at exactly the same muzzle velocity, a shell with a profile of the Mark 8 would travel further than the Mark 13 anyway. And so with the Iowa's guns, that's why that happens. And I say with the South Dakotas and North Carolinas, essentially what's happening there is that the Mark 8 shell is so heavy relative to the Mark 13 that with the, again, comparatively speaking, short length of gun barrel, the Mark 8 is just isn't taking up as much of the energy from the propellant as it potentially could, and therefore it's starting out with a significant kneecap in terms of its energy going over distance. Nikujaga Oishi asks, has there ever been any reluctance or opposition to the use of foreign mythological names like Orion, Bellerophon, Hector, Hercules, etc. to name Royal Navy ships? I feel like other countries' ships have more nationalistic names. For example, it would seem pretty strange if there was an Italian cruiser named Thor, or something similar to that. Not particularly, at least at the time that they were introduced. Now, that timing is rather critical, because when you look at pretty much all of the relatively well-known, if you like, foreign mythological names, mostly, let's face it, Greco-Roman, being introduced into Royal Navy service, they come in two big waves, kind of in the middle of the 1600s and then again in the middle of the 1700s, which is right bang in the middle of the overall time period, which is known to some people as the Enlightenment. But essentially, one of the things that characterizes that time period is this fascination with Greco-Roman mythology, and there's a certain sense, at least as far as I understand it, in those kind of philosophical circles, that because Greco-Roman society as a whole is sort of the foundation for most of European civilization, at the very least, certainly Western and Central European civilization, then, and to a degree Eastern, but it's less accepted in the East, apart from Russia declaring itself the new Rome and things like that. But never mind. The point is that they have this concept of sort of the Greco-Roman mythology being this shared inheritance of everybody, including, obviously, the Royal Navy and the British establishment as a whole, and therefore, when they start using these names, there's not really any pushback against it. Now, if you tried to start that, maybe 100 years earlier, in the 1500s, or even in the early 1600s, there would have been an awful lot more pushback. It would have been sort of more traditionally, the weird kind of Catholic heading into Protestant that you had in the mid to late Tudor times, and then establishing more as a Anglican-Protestant religious base in the early Stuart times, and that society would have pushed back a lot more against what they would have seen as both foreign and pagan names being used on royal ships, which is why you don't usually see that kind of terminology being used in the Tudor Navy, for example, in the Armada. But, the Armada campaign specifically. But once you move beyond, say, the mid to late 1700s, and you're starting to head into the 1800s, and then obviously into the 20th century, at that stage, the names that get reused are now getting reused because they are now a Royal Navy names. They have a legend associated with them from the achievements of past ships. And at that point, because obviously you have various swings of religiosity versus philosophy and so forth going back in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But at that stage, it's more about, if you name the Orion class super dreadnoughts or the Bellerophon class dreadnoughts or whatever, people are going to look at those names in the early 20th century and go, oh, they're naming them after Nelson ships. Nelson ships were called this. This is a good thing. People weren't really thinking, oh yeah, Bellerophon, the hero of a slightly obscure Greek myth, and so forth. Prussian Hill asks, are there any books or resources that specifically address Operation Sealion? And if there are multiple books on point, are there any specific titles you would recommend? With the amount of attention that's been devoted to Operation Sealion, including German preparations, British planned responses, and wargaming, one would think there are at least a few books on the subject. There are actually a huge number of books published about Operation Sealion. The problem is, if you're wanting to look at it from a historical perspective, you can get somewhat overwhelmed by the sheer number of alternate history books detailing what the author thinks would have happened had Operation Sealion actually gone ahead, to my mind, varying degrees of plausibility. My own thoughts on Operation Sealion are not particularly charitable, but that's a topic for another video. Now, in terms of which ones should you get to give you a good idea of what's going on with all of this, I would say that you probably want to go with the following. If you can only get one book, then you want to get the one by Peter Schenck. It's a little technical, but you asked the question, so I'm going to assume that you like vaguely technical description. I mean, you come to this channel. So there's actually kind of two versions. There's Invasion of England 1940, The Planning of Operation Sealion, which is a book from 1990, but still very good. And there appears to be an updated version called Operation Sealion, The Invasion of England 1940, which was published in 2019, which will probably be easier to get hold of. That would be the one that I would go for. And it looks primarily at what preparations the Germans made. And of course, as with any Operation Sealion book, he does also give his opinion on how he thinks it would have gone. The next one I would get is Jeff Hewitt's Hitler's Armada, the Royal Navy and the Defence of Great Britain, April to October 1940, because that goes into something which there's a surprising amount of archival material on, but which very rarely actually gets mentioned in the Operation Sealion narrative, because it is mostly dominated, understandably, by the Battle of Britain. And of course, very little needs to be said about just how many books have been written about the Battle of Britain. But if you want to understand the often overlooked naval defence element of Operation Sealion, that would be my go-to. So that will kind of give you the German side and then the British side. If you then want another fairly well-researched take on it, and of course the author's opinion, then you can get Robert Forsyth's, I think that's how it's pronounced, We March Against England, Operation Sealion, 1940 to 41. So, again, that goes into a lot of depth about the German preparations and everything. And I would say that's probably the three books which you could use to look at Sealion itself and the preparations for it in a reasonable amount of depth. Beyond that, there would be, I think, three other books that I would recommend. One is by Walter Schellenberg and John Erickson, called Invasion 1940, The Nazi Plan for Britain. That isn't specifically about Sealion, but it is a translation of the German handbook that was prepared for the occupation forces had the invasion succeeded, which is very interesting in that it gives a bit more of an insight as to what the Germans thought they were going to be facing. Then you've got Dr. Paddy Griffith and Dr. John Curry's Paddy Griffith's Wargaming's Operation Sealion, the game that launched academic wargaming, which is not about Sealion itself, but it is a very in-depth history of that big war game that they did in the Cold War, which obviously is referenced quite a bit. And then one last book which I would recommend, which is about Operation Sealion, but I would strongly recommend because it's not just about Sealion itself. It's also, like with the second book I recommended, about British defences against Operation Sealion. But whereas the previous one I recommended looks very much in detail at the Royal Navy's preparations to defend the coastline, this book looks at the much broader view of what the British were doing across Europe and even around the world as part of their preparations for the defences of Operation Sealion, and also goes into some of the more interesting, darker elements of just how ruthless the British were prepared to be in defence of, well, England mainly, because that's where the landings were going to take place. And that's by Leo McKinstry, and it's called Operation Sealion, How Britain Crushed the German War Machine's Dreams of Invasion in 1940. Because as I mentioned before, in a few other Drydock questions, one of the things, I mean, obviously we said the Royal Navy gets undersold quite a bit with Sealion, but one of the other things that very often gets undersold because people think, oh, they're just a bunch of, old people cosplaying as soldiers, is the Home Guard. Because, yeah, the Home Guard was made up largely of older people, but they weren't cosplaying as soldiers. The vast, 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 vast majority of the Home Guard had served in World War I. So, again, as I've said before, with the whole, the army plan to set fire to the beaches using vast amounts of oil, which is kind of a flex on the Germans anyway, but there's this plan to set fire to the beaches to stop the Germans landing, and then the Home Guard's like, no. We understand the flooding the beaches with oil part, that's all good, but you let the Germans land first, then you set it all on fire with the Germans on it. That would be a much more effective demonstration. Because, these were guys who'd seen the horrors of the First World War and were being told those people are now coming for your homes and family. They were prepared to do, not so much stray into the realm of war crimes in the Geneva Convention. It was more like, where's that list of the Geneva Convention? Let me use it as a tick box exercise to figure out what we can do to the Germans. Don't mess with a bunch of World War I veterans who've been told they're coming for your homes. Here's essentially whatever we can spare to help you defend them. It gets very dark very quickly. But anyway, those are the books I would recommend. BK Zhang asks, given that all centerline main batteries seem like a no-brainer once the technology for turrets was in place, why did they take so long to come about, at least in some navies? There's a whole slew of factors, but three of the biggest ones are, firstly, machinery. The amount of volume that you needed for boilers and engines, especially vertical triple expansion engines, but even some of the early turbines and the associated boilers, was such that the machinery would take up so much space down the centre line of the ship that you physically didn't have the room at either end of the ship to do an all-centreline armament with a decent broadside. And so the only alternative at that point was to stick additional turrets on the wings to give you a decentish broadside. Whether you did those as wing turrets or as an echelon turrets for a bit of cross-deck firing, it's kind of depending on the ship, depending on the navy. The next issue was whether or not your turrets were actually capable of being super firing. So one of the issues with British turrets for quite a while in the pre-World War I and early World War I period was sighting hoods. Now, these had some advantages in as much as it meant that if you lost your communication with your central fire control system, the sighting hoods would allow you to maintain fire on a per turret basis. This being, as you can see here with HMS Hercules, an era before rangefinders were being installed in or on the turrets, as well as on the, the spotting positions and so forth. But the problem with having an open sighting hood was that if you had a superfiring turret immediately above and behind you, and the turret above you were fired, the blast could then come through the sighting hood and into the lower turret, which would do bad things to people, at which point your alternatives were either to not have the sighting hood, or to have a superfiring turret with a sighting hood set up, but accept that you couldn't fire the upper turret directly fore or directly aft over a range of angles, or you just didn't do it, at which point, again, you were probably going to run out of space on the centre line, and so wing or an echelon turrets became a thing. And then the last reason, which is probably the least reason, but it does pop up in some ships, is the idea of end on fire, which you see to a certain, I think probably actually the longest proponent of that idea was actually the French, but back in the pre-Dreadnought period, and then the British under Fisher take it up for a little bit in the early Dreadnought period. This idea that if you put everything on the centre line, yeah, you've got a brilliant broadside, but your ability to fire forward or aft, if you're charging or retreating, is somewhat more limited. And then having wing or an echelon turrets means that you still have a decent broadside, and while your overall broadside isn't quite as strong as it could be given the number of guns you've fitted on the ship, your end-on fire is considerably stronger than it would be. So, for example, Dreadnought has an 8-gun broadside, South Carolina has an 8-gun broadside, but South Carolina gets an 8-gun broadside from actually having 8 guns. Dreadnought has 10, but obviously being with two twin turrets on the wings, one on each side, you can't fire one of those on any given broadside. But if South Carolina is chasing a target dead on, it can only fire 4 guns, whereas Dreadnought, in theory, can fire 6. And if South Carolina is retreating, then it again can only fire 4, and Dreadnought, in theory, although under Fisher's paradigm, why would it ever be retreating? But if it was, it could fire 8. So Dreadnought actually, in theory, again, has as much firepower aft as it does on either side, and still a considerable amount of firepower forward. As it turned out, you probably didn't need that, but that was also a factor. There are a few other smaller factors as well, but those are probably the big 3. The Huskarl asks, back in the day, monarchs regularly led their armies into battle. I would presume they had the same authority to lead their fleets into battle as well, but I'm unaware of any specific instances. How common was it for a king or lord to fight a naval battle, and why was it much rarer generally? I think there's 2 slightly different things there. Kings fighting in a naval battle and leading their navy was exceptionally rare. It did occasionally happen. Here's Christian IV, I think, in a fight between the Danes and the Swedes, leading his fleet into battle. But more broadly speaking, kings generally didn't fight in a naval battle. Lords, however, there were a lot of lords in naval battles, partly because in the medieval and even in the early age of sail, so we're talking 1600s-ish, the idea of a high-ranking aristocrat needing to be in charge because he is a high-ranking aristocrat, more so than any tactical capability, although a high-ranking aristocrat who also knew something about sailing was also held to be quite useful, was very definitely a thing. So the Armada campaign is a good example. The Duke of Medina Sidonia is in command of the Armada. Lord Howard of Effingham is in command of the British fleet, or the English fleet, I suppose it is at that point. And then, of course, you also have the fact that as you go forward in time into the classic age of sail, you will have naval officers who have just come up through the ranks of the officership, but also happen to be aristocrats with significant titles. And you have others who are not high-ranking aristocrats, but have been ennobled because of various victories that they've won. Like, John Jervis becomes Earl St. Vincent, and so on and so forth. I mean, Nelson was a baron at the very least by the time of Trafalgar. Neither of them had started out with any titles, but they were fighting with having noble titles by the end of their active service careers, and various other officers were as well. So high-ranking aristocrats on a ship, very common, but kings not so much. And that's essentially because the difference between land battles and naval battles, at least early on, was twofold. One, a land battle could depend very much on personal leadership, personal courage, and your ability to survive that battle could be very much multiplied by simply the fact that you were rich. If you are Henry V at the Battle of Agincourt and you have your corps of retainers and bodyguards around you, you can spend an absolute fortune on the latest and best armor, and obviously all the training necessary to fight hand to hand, and that makes you and your small force considerably more lethal and considerably more likely to survive than your average Joe or even your average knight. And that appeals to the kings because it means they can show personal courage or they can show leadership, and there's a relatively low chance that they're going to get themselves killed. Whereas in a naval battle, even when boarding action is the way of fighting, or a large part of the way of fighting, there's still a chance of drowning, and there's still a chance of your ship sinking, and no bodyguard in the world can make you magically buoyant. And when it comes to land battles as well, you can usually see how everybody is setting up, make your general plans, you have advisors to help you, they'll obviously influence your plans usually, you pass those over to the commanders of the various units, and then outside of some very general coordination, you generally are letting the professionals get on with things while also theoretically having a command role. Whereas battles at sea, things are constantly shifting, so you would have to come up with a plan much, much faster, and in most naval battles, you generally need to give some relatively specific directions relatively constantly to enable your fleet to be effective. And that kind of fast decision loop is not something that a king who isn't particularly experienced with fighting in naval warfare is going to be able to do. So it's much better to appoint somebody else to do it who is more likely to actually win the fight in the first place. And then as time goes on and firearms and artillery become more and more commonplace, it becomes even rarer to see a king in battle because, well, a reasonable number of kings who tried to lead their armies from the front lines ended up getting killed by random artillery shot or firearms, etc. Because, yeah, it doesn't matter how good your plate armor is. If you get hit by a cannonball, you're still very, very dead. And put that over into seaborne actions, so end of the 1500s onwards, and there's an awful lot more cannonballs flying around, and suddenly your one king, it becomes a rather difficult casualty to explain to, oh, well, he was just hit by one of the 4,000 cannon shot that happened to pass by that day. Although there was a tradition, certainly in the UK, and I think in a number of other countries, of the second or third sons of the monarch heading off into a naval career, which was often surprising in that a good number of them actually turned out to be half-decent naval officers, and some of them would continue their career all the way up, but quite a number of them would also have circumstances overtake them. Now, yeah, there were some who were just pretty useless. They were just there because of their rank. But, for example, by all accounts, the man who would become King George VI, the father of Queen Elizabeth II, the grandfather of the current king in the UK. He was not supposed to inherit the throne. He was the second son. He went into the Royal Navy. He fought at the Battle of Jutland. By all accounts, a very good sailor, well regarded. But the whole abdication crisis in the 1930s, where we got rid of the slightly more Nazi-loving side of the royal family, put George VI on the throne. So he was now king and couldn't follow his naval career. Prince Philip, as I've covered on this channel, not a British royal, a Greek royal initially, but then became a British royal. But he, on his own merits, very well could have gone all the way up to being first Sea Lord, but got that career sidetracked by becoming a Prince Consort. And going further back, a slightly odd one, James, Prince James, Duke of York, brother of Charles II, was, by all accounts, a courageous, popular, and pretty darn good admiral. He led parts of the Royal Navy during one of the various Anglo-Dutch wars, and by all accounts, the Royal Navy rather liked him. And the fact that he was not so secretly a Catholic at a time when, let's just say England was not a fan of Catholicism, didn't matter so much, because people were like, well, he's an admiral, he's not going to take over the monarchy or anything. And at that point, as long as he blows up our enemies, we don't really care what particular manner of worship he undertakes. Then Charles II died without a male heir, and James II took over, and suddenly the fact that he was a Catholic became incredibly important. So if Charles II had a legitimate son, and he had succeeded him, and James was able to just continue being an admiral, probably at least British history would have had a lot more favourable an opinion of him. Brendan Boersdorf asks, since we were talking about woodwork under fire, I'm curious, were there welding teams to patch holes on more modern steel ships, or were they just damage control parties with no one really worrying about stopping the leaks? There were certainly welding efforts once portable shipboard welding equipment became available, but there weren't welding teams as such in the damage control parties with the express purpose of finding the hole and patching it over with a big sheet of steel. Mainly because by the time you get to all-steel ships, projectiles have become considerably larger and heavier, and usually considerably more explosive than they were in the age of sail, in the era of wooden ships. Because back then, even if someone hits you with a truly monstrous round, let's say a 42-pounder, the hole's still only going to be 8 to 10 inches across at the most. And at that point, 2 or 3 planks will cover that over, and the amount of water coming in, because the ships aren't going particularly fast, and if you're getting hold of the waterline by cannon shots, probably also not very deep either. The amount of water that's coming in is controllable by a few people. Whereas if you get hit by a 16-inch shell and it blows a socking great hole in the side of the ship, well, one, there's going to be twisted metal all over the place, which is going to make it very difficult for you to find somewhere flat to start welding your plate to. And, well, you're not going to start cutting away all the bent bits, because one, you're making the hole bigger, and two, if the shell's exploded like that, there's going to be a very, very, very big hole, torpedoes and mines as well, through which huge amounts of water are pouring. You probably aren't going to be able to get anywhere near it. And also that amount of water is going to fill up the space you're in far, far, far too quickly. So damage control, when you get to incidents like that, it becomes a lot more about securing the nearest still watertight bulkheads and then shoring them up against the incoming flow and pressure of water. That's where welding teams might come in handy, because they can weld strengthening strips or weld hatches shut and things like that to try and increase their strength. But there's still a fair amount of timber work that goes into 20th century and modern damage control, because wood can be a lot more quickly cut and shaped than steel can. It's less dense, so it's much more easily transportable, and therefore if you want to shore up a bulkhead and brace it against stuff and so forth, it's actually far, far, far quicker to do that using a bunch of timber that is pre-stored aboard the ship than it is to try and do that by lugging down big, wraps of steel and things like that. Chris Southgate asks, I noticed in a number of photos of the French cruisers that they're being launched from sheds or covered slipways. I only recall open slipways being British practice. While obtusely an advantage of French practice is that there's less weathering during construction, you've stated several times that infrastructure was a drag on Marine Nationale ship construction. Would the sheds have affected this, and what are the advantages or disadvantages of such a system, especially given that the modern day practice of places like BAE is for fully enclosed construction? Well, first off, well spotted. So covered sheds or covered slipways are actually a relatively common occurrence further back in time. So, for example, actually, if you go to the Chatham Historic Dockyard these days, they have what are called the boat sheds, and those and or structures like them were very often used for the construction of ships. There would be slipways and so forth underneath them. There's a few famous engravings and paintings of ships of the line being launched, and even in the middle of the 19th century, and you can quite clearly see that those ships have been built in a boat shed or a ship shed, I guess, and are emerging into daylight. And as you say, it does offer some advantage, especially in the wooden era, where you don't necessarily want storms and snow and everything settling on your wood and ruining it. And that practice does still continue in the age of iron and steel, even though, rust aside, they are less susceptible to the elements. But as shipyards expand, and they're building, as we said, iron and steel ships that don't necessarily need the covered sheds, they tend to abandon them, because obviously they are big, expensive structures, and they come with ongoing maintenance costs and so forth. And yes, if you are trying to expand your infrastructure, then having a covered slipway or a boat shed can be a problem. Firstly, because if you want to maintain the coverage, you're going to have to go through the additional expense of building the shed or onto the extension. Secondly, of course, as you can see with Algeriche, is quite an angle here. So if you are trying to do a slipway and you're extending that slipway further away from the river or the estuary or whatever, then that's going to be at an even higher elevation, which means potentially you're going to run out of headroom, or you might have to build a step on the shed. And of course, if you want to widen the dry dock or slipway, if it's in the open, that's a much easier thing to do, although it's still not easy, but easier than if you've got a whole structure over it, which will probably have to just be completely demolished. And so, to a certain extent, the relatively high prevalence of covered slipways in Marine Nationale infrastructure is kind of a reflection that a lot of it is quite dated and hasn't been updated or improved all that much since these things were in vogue. Now, you can see with Algeriche Shed, it's not a completely wooden structure like you have at Chatham, so it is a somewhat more modern structure, but it's still a kind of an older school way of doing it. Although, as you point out, as things have gotten more and more complex and there's a lot more sensitive electronics built into ships these days, ironically enough, the covered shed form of construction has actually come back in a big way in a lot of places. Salamin Shakia 93 asks, I was watching parts of the shipyard's archived streams on the Abercrombie class some time ago, and I noticed one of the reference plans used shows her buoyancy space in the anti-torpedo bulges marked open to sea. What are the pros and cons of having the buoyancy spaces being opened to the sea while situated either outboard of the main armour belt, as in the Hood, Nelsons and the Monitors, or behind the armour belt, like with the KGVs and Vanguard, and the spaces topped either somewhere below or above the waterline? If they were not open to the sea, would they be fully filled or nearly full? So all of this comes down to the way that the torpedo defense systems work for contact detonating torpedoes. Essentially, you want liquid and void layers, because liquid layers are very good at absorbing fragments and slowing them down, but because liquid is, as far as this use is concerned, effectively incompressible, it means that the shock of the explosion is transmitted through it quite effectively. Conversely, with a void section, the void dissipates the force of the explosion quite easily as it expands through the just essentially air, but of course it offers very little resistance to any fragments that are created. So that's why you want both parts of the system in your torpedo defense. Now, there's always a trade-off. So when you look at different nations' torpedo defense systems, both at the same period of time and also over time as they develop from the 1910s through to the 1940s, you'll see some systems have a void on the outboard side and some systems have a liquid layer on the outboard side. And it's essentially that trade-off of what do you want to dissipate first. Plus, of course, if you're hit by a smaller torpedo warhead, like an airdrop torpedo, for example, if you have an air or void section first, that's obviously going to be flooded, whatever hits you, and that could cause more of a list because it's absorbing the full brunt of the explosion, so the hole's likely to be bigger, the flooding's likely to be more, and also it's the furthest away from the ship's center of gravity, so the list will be more. Conversely, if you have a liquid layer, well, it's already liquid, so you can't flood it more than it already is, but it will transmit more of the explosive force further into the torpedo defense system, thus, technically speaking, heightening the chance that that explosive force might do more damage further in, but you won't have as much immediate list. And there's a few other trade-offs as well, but essentially that's why you sometimes have various differences. Now, with the Abercrombie class, what you have is the actual outermost bit of the torpedo defense system is a void space. It's watertight. Then you have a liquid layer, and that's the bit that's open to sea, and then you have another void space inside of that, and then obviously the rest of the ship's hull. So when you see an Abercrombie class like here, you can see the start of the bulge as the hull slopes out just above the waterline, and it's that area in particular that you're looking at that is the bit that's actually open to the sea. The bit that's further out and under the water is actually still fully watertight, so it's one layer within the torpedo defense system. And as for why it would be open to the sea, well, one, it's a cheap and easy way of ensuring that that liquid section is always going to be full of liquid, and two, there was a theory at the time that if you had these sections open to the sea, then when the force of the explosion obviously crumples up and dissipates along the length of the void section, and then that lessened per square foot shock hits the liquid section, some of that force that's being transmitted through the liquid section, instead of transmitting straight through to the other side, might use some of its energy in agitating the water and expelling it through the holes that are open to the sea. So, some of it will be ejected down, but a lot of it will probably be projected up in a series of big fountains. And that, it was hoped, would lessen the amount of force that would actually be transmitted through to the next void layer. There were similar ideas along that same kind of general deflection of blast principle built into other torpedo defense systems, and they had a qualified degree of success. The main problem being that as torpedo warheads got bigger and more powerful, the amount of energy dissipated as a proportion of the total energy being inputted continued to drop, because obviously there's only so much energy you can dissipate in that manner. Nosdormu89 asks, Hollywood seems to have developed the belief that a single-engined multi-machine gun or autocannon armed fighter like a P-51 or a Spitfire could, with one or two strafing runs, cripple or outright destroy a large warship such as a destroyer. I'd cite movies like Red Tails and the Tuskegee Airmen. My question is, what is the historical basis for this belief, and barring a golden BB hit on a ready-use locker or similar, what damage could a strafing run do to a destroyer other than providing target practice for the anti-aircraft gun crews? Well, we're lucky enough to actually have some footage of a Japanese ship being strafed by a Hellcat. So one of the first things you'll notice, and this is just going to be playing on loop as we go through the question here, is that there's a lot of ricochets. You can see the tracer rounds, and a fairly large amount of them are actually bouncing off the ship and going in all sorts of weird and wonderful directions. However, not all of them are. Another thing you'll notice is that the pilot seems to be concentrating his strafing run around the superstructure. It kind of starts roughly at a level of where the bow gun is, and then kind of tracks across the bridge and associated superstructure, finishing off near the forefunnel as the Japanese ship is moving through the water. So, in terms of what damage you could do, it does depend quite a bit on what you're shooting. Obviously, the Hellcat in this case is using 50 cals. If it was a Corsair or a Seafire, there's going to be 20mm cannon rounds in there as well. And those can do a lot more damage because, of course, they have an explosive payload. In terms of what you could hit, well, on deck, there are going to be things like torpedoes, as you mentioned, potentially ready-use lockers, but torpedoes are a relatively hefty target. You could potentially also hit ammunition that's actually being handled, especially if there's dual-purpose guns out. You're unlikely to set the charge off, but you never know. But the broader capability of whether you're shooting machine guns or cannons is really twofold. Firstly, although you can see from some of the tracer that comes back that someone on that ship is shooting back an anti-aircraft gun, the first thing is that most of the anti-aircraft gunners are going to be exposed or behind very minimal shielding. So a strafing run would historically be aimed at suppressing those gunners, either by making them duck for cover or killing or wounding them, which would then make the approach of the much easier targets of the dive bombers and the torpedo bombers much, much safer, so they could finish it off. So that's really the main reason why you'd be doing a strafing run in a fighter as opposed to something like a medium bomber, which might have a lot more guns and a lot heavier guns. The other thing that you might be doing, as it appears this Hellcat pilot is doing, is aiming for the bridge, the command section, because if you can kill off the bridge crew and the ship's staff and perhaps cripple some of the more easily accessible control equipment, that might leave the ship very vulnerable again to follow-up attacks, because it might be out of control, or just, the morale effect and the lack of leadership if the senior officers are killed off, and so on. Another thing is that it's not just explosives in terms of propellant or torpedoes that might be set off. There are also other flammable things aboard a ship that could be accessed by cannon, or in this case tracer rounds from a 50 cal, and setting fire to a ship could, especially a destroyer, could cause quite a lot of issues, especially if that fire is set by an extreme strafing run, which might have then also killed everybody in the local vicinity with bullets, which would make it a lot harder for anyone to report the fire and for anyone to do anything about it. And on some select targets, it is actually possible to do even more damage than that, particularly with Japanese ships, because there is a whole slew of Japanese vessels, particularly around the turn of the 20s into the 30s, when you have things like the Fourth Fleet incident and so forth, where they're going extreme measures on lightening the ship. So very, very thin superstructures, and even in some cases quite thin hull plating, because normally even an average destroyer's hull plating should be able to bounce at least bullets, maybe not 20mm rounds, but certainly at least bullets, and high explosive 20mm rounds, which is typically what you'd find in a fighter, probably that as well. And as we said, as you can see, some of them are being deflected in this case, but a large number of smaller Japanese ships had hull and superstructure plating that was thin enough that actually a 50 cal bullet might well go through, with enough force to continue to do damage internally. And that's where the real money is. Then you're talking about things like steam pipes, potentially the engineering spaces, electrical cables, that kind of thing. So very specifically going after certain Japanese vessels, you could possibly cripple a destroyer or cause something very significant to catch fire or go boom with a strafing run if you were accurate enough and or just dumped enough ammunition into it. Once you get a bit larger with things like cruisers, or if you're going after something that isn't built like tinfoil, like a German or Italian ship, the chances of you outright crippling or destroying such a vessel go down to almost nothing. But even in those cases, by doing things like strafing the bridge, you could cripple it, at least temporarily, by wiping out the command crew. Or when you're looking at taking out the torpedoes, sure, if they're not powered by pure oxygen the way the Japanese are, they're not going to explode quite as vigorously, but they are still full of large amounts of compressed air, which, if you mix that with tracer rounds, is probably not going to do much good to the middle of a destroyer. Plus, something that I think Hollywood sometimes misses is the fact that by the late stage of the war, quite a lot of fighters that were doing this kind of strafing activity also happened to be carrying rockets or bombs, which could do significantly more damage to a destroyer, and they might be strafing on their way in, partly to suppress the defences and improve their own chances of survival, but also it kind of gives you a good idea as to how exactly you're aimed at the target ship for later release of your heavier ordnance. But especially if you're carrying a bomb, that's obviously not going to be caught on a gun camera like this. Michael Imbezi asks, what time, local, UTC, time of home port, etc., did ships in World War I and World War II use to record battle events, etc., in their logbooks, and does this ever cause problems or annoyance for historians? Usually, ships will record time in their home port's time, which for most countries also usually means just their local home nation's time. So, for example, German ships in the High Seas Fleet in World War I will use Berlin time. British ships obviously will use GMT. French ships usually also end up using the same because we're on the same longitude. In America, it's a little bit more difficult because, of course, East Coast and West Coast time are quite different from each other. So at times you'll find logs which are recorded in East Coast time if they're based in Norfolk, West Coast time if they're based in San Diego, Hawaiian time if they're based in Hawaii, at Pearl Harbor, and sometimes the Asiatic Squadron will record time in Manila time. There are occasional attempts to standardize, but for something the size of the US, it doesn't really tend to work. Centralizing around GMT, aka UTC, is a somewhat more recent development. And does it cause problems or annoyance for historians? Absolutely. The two biggest problems are actually the Pacific theatre of World War II and indeed any conflict that's fought across the Pacific, so elements of the Spanish-American War as well, for example. And then also generally naval battles in World War I in European waters. And the reason for this is, well, it's all to do with time zones, but actually two slightly different things. Because if, say, for example, you had a fight between, I don't know, the Ottoman Empire and Spain. They're at opposite ends of the Mediterranean. They're a few time zones apart. If they have a fight and the Spanish are running off Madrid time, let's say, and the Ottomans are running off of Istanbul time, or Constantinople time, depending on what time period you're looking at, the two logs are going to be in completely different time increments, but they're going to be different enough that you can go, okay, these are the common events. It's fairly easy to synchronize. The problem with the other two scenarios I mentioned is that when you're talking about a campaign across the Pacific, you have the international date line down the middle, which means that you can have orders and so forth either being given, so recorded as being transmitted in Hawaii or in the US on a certain day, but if the ship that's recording events is in the Western Pacific, they're in a completely different day than the Eastern Pacific, which means the logbook will be out by a full day, not to mention obviously the time differential as well. And with US ships, that's usually not as much of an issue because US ships, as I said, often do use the timing of their home port, so they might be running on the day that he actually is in the US. But then if you compare that to Japanese records, and this is before getting into people with different calendar systems, but if you're comparing it to Japanese records, even if you translate that over into the Roman calendar system, or if they are using the Roman calendar system in that particular report, they're going to be a whole day off from the American system before time zone differences are taken into effect. So that's a problem. But for me, the most frustrating bit is actually when you're comparing things like Imperial German and Royal Navy records from World War One, because at least with the Japanese and the American logs for the Pacific, they're so far apart that you can just go, okay, look, we just have to set up a conversion and that's that. Whereas if you're looking through multiple different records for something like, say, Jutland, that's an engagement that goes on for hours and hours and hours and hours, but the time zone difference between the UK and Germany is considerably less than that. In fact, GMT and Central European time are only 1 hour apart. And that runs into the problem of the logs actually being too close together. Because if you have a battle that spans 5, 6, 7+ hours, possibly more if you take the whole thing into account, if you're looking at a log that says, well, at 15:15 so-and-so happened, let's say we opened fire on this ship, and then you look at, let's say, the German log. So say the British log has said that, and the German log says, well, at 15:15 everything was fine. You've got to remember, oh yeah, hang on a minute, I need to look for a separate entry at 16:15. But if you're looking immediately at 15:15 and it says, oh yeah, we came, let's say 15:17, we came under fire, if you're not careful, you might go, okay, well, the British log says they opened fire at 15:15. The German log says they were under fire from someone at 15:17. So that's probably just the clocks on the ships being slightly out. That's perfectly understandable. So this is the same instance. So at that point, the German ship was here, the British ship was here. So they were engaging each other. And you've missed the fact that actually, no, that instant, although it looks like it was only 2 minutes apart, was actually an hour apart, and you need to go and look for the 16:15 entry and see what happened to that German ship then, and vice versa. If you're looking at the German times, you have to remember to look 1 hour back on the British times, etc., etc. And it's close enough that, as I said, in a big battle like that, you can get very confused with so many similar incidents happening across multiple hours. Unemployed History Major asks, you've mentioned ships having a senior enlisted person throughout history who served the traditional role of captain's right hand, but what about at higher echelons? I assume there's a senior chief for a flotilla, but what about squadrons or fleets? What does their role look like, and how has that changed through history and within different navies? While I'm vaguely aware that in some modern navies there have been non-commissioned or warrant officer ranks which are kind of above the rank structure of a specific ship, as far as historically goes, i.e. the time period that the channel covers, I don't think there really has been senior enlisted positions at flotilla, squadron, fleet levels, except by special appointment. So, for example, if an admiral was moving flagship in the Age of Sail and he had a particularly experienced, let's say, ship's master, he might choose to bring that man with him for various purposes, although obviously that would be a little bit fraught because there could potentially be a clash with the master of the existing master on the ship that he was moving to. So admiral staffs, back when admirals had a greater hand of freedom in selecting them, might have some particularly favoured senior enlisted, but that wouldn't be a de facto thing. That would be very much down to the admiral in question. But I'm not aware of formal positions existing for those kinds of things. The only real exception to that, to a certain degree, is that at very specific points, especially in the older period that the channel covers, the Age of Sail and so forth, you would get positions like a chief purser for a dockyard, or perhaps even for an entire navy, or not just a purser, but something along those lines, some kind of admin role. And while those were very often political appointees given out as favours, often given to the nobility, or as retirement sinecures for, captains and admirals who really were never going to go out to sea again. Occasionally you would find, maybe a purser who had served in the fleet for 30, 40 years might be appointed to a purser's position ashore, where technically he would be having oversight of the money for multiple ships or squadrons as kind of a reward for long service. And then when you move into the more modern era, the era of steam and steel, if you had a particularly experienced officer, again, so at that point might be someone like a senior gunner or a senior torpedo man who was really, really good at what they did, you might bring them ashore and put them in a gunnery training establishment or a torpedo training establishment, or a retiring ship's master might go to a sail training vessel. And at that point, then obviously they would have oversight of a larger program than just a single ship, still subordinate to the actual commissioned officers present there, but it would be a larger role than just being part of a single ship's crew. But again, that's kind of ad hoc rather than there is a specific place for a senior enlisted person at this level all the time. Vokir asks, assuming the UK had been forced to bow out or heavily restrict its warlike actions due to the U-boat threat during 1917, could the US and France have put together enough forces to continue to enforce the blockade on Germany, or at the very least stop Germany from enacting the same blockade on France in return? If Britain's forced to bow out of the war and isn't able to use the Royal Navy any longer in blockade duties, then no, France and the US can't easily continue to enforce that blockade, partly because if Britain's out of the war, they can't use British coastal waters, which is going to be a problem, but also they're not going to have access to British bases and so forth, so holding something like the North Sea blockade would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible. The Channel potentially could continue to be blocked because it is a fairly narrow choke point, but that's the lesser of the two big issues that they'd be facing in terms of where you can actually blockade. And simply put, the French don't have the naval forces, period, in this time, and the US at the time of 1917 also do not have the forces, because remember, thanks to the various funding issues the US Navy had faced, the US is very, very top-heavy. So it has some destroyers, essentially no effective cruisers, and quite a number of battleships, but you really don't want to be putting battleships on blockade duty when there's lots of U-boats around. Fast forward 2-3 years to when the Wicks and Clemson class spam has, really picked up, then you'd have a fair number of destroyers, and of course there's a reasonable number of merchant ships for armed merchantmen and so forth that you could do. You'd still have the range and basing issues, though, for the North Sea blockade. So it would be a very, very difficult and, in the short term, impossible to completely lock Germany up. But in terms of stopping the Germans blockading France, that much is a lot more doable, because to prevent a blockade from being fully effective, well, being able to block the Channel will definitely help with that, because it will mean that any attempts by the Germans to make a blockade on France would have to go all the way around the UK, which limits the number of ships and subs they can actually use for that. But also, US forces can base themselves in French ports, and of course then they just have to pop out to attack whatever German ships are trying to enforce the blockade, which is a lot easier than sailing up the Channel, because the Straits of Dover are just as much as a choke point for, in this case, American and French ships as they would be for the Germans, and then all the way up the North Sea, or going all the way around the UK to enact some kind of blockade up there. So that part would be a lot easier. And finally for this week, Andronor asks, would it have been feasible for medium or heavy bombers to be fitted with torpedoes for attacks against ships, as compared to them engaging in level bombing as they historically did? Yes, it is feasible, and some of them actually were. You can see here a Vickers Wellington, with its nose turret deleted, being loaded up with a pair of torpedoes. The Italians used the SM-79 as a torpedo bomber, and the Germans used the Heinkel 111 as a torpedo bomber. Now, one thing you might notice that all of these have in common, and there were other bombers that were also used as torpedo bombers, is that for the most part, these are medium bombers heading towards the heavier end of medium, but you're not seeing, B-29s, Lancasters, that kind of thing floating around with torpedoes. And that's for a few reasons. I mean, apart from the expense, both in terms of money and crew involved in heavy bombers compared to medium bombers, but also in terms of agility, because you still need a certain degree of agility, not just to get low and slow enough to drop torpedoes and aim them in the first place, but also to cope with things like turbulence and do so without crashing into the sea and such like. And with the best will in the world, you probably don't want to take a big 4-engined heavy bomber down to 50 feet or whatever to try and drop torpedoes. It's most likely not going to end well. Another limitation is that because torpedoes are quite long, while something like, say, the Wellington has more than enough weight lift capacity to carry 2 torpedoes, or potentially considerably more, and 4-engine bombers more so still, the fact is that because of the sheer length of a torpedo, you'll actually run out of space in the bomb bay to fit torpedoes well before you run out of weight capacity on a big bomber to lift said torpedoes. So there is a bit of a diminishing returns in that case. Some twin-engine bombers that were converted to a torpedo role, while they had range, they still could only carry a single torpedo. Stuff like the HE-111 or the Wellington here could carry 2, but it wasn't a universal rule. And of course, they're much bigger targets, so easier to shoot down, and obviously, as I said, will cost a lot more both in money and manpower if they are shot down, which is a bit of a dissuading factor. However, they did have their uses, particularly on both sides against merchant convoys. The Germans obviously used quite a number against the Arctic convoys with aircraft based out of Norway. The Wellingtons, for the most part, seem to have operated out of Malta against Italian convoys running down to North Africa. And the reason for this wasn't so much that they'd fly at a target and drop 2 torpedoes on slightly different bearings and hope at least one of them hit, although that did occasionally happen. The other thing that they could do was that because a merchant convoy generally wouldn't have that much in the way of anti-aircraft defences, and if they did have an anti-aircraft defence vessel, you could go, okay, well, I won't attack that bit of the convoy, I'll go after this other bit that's not so well defended. You could roll in, drop a torpedo, fly off, circle a little bit, wait to see what happens with that torpedo, and then if it misses, unlike a smaller craft, well, one, you probably actually got there in the first place because you had the range, but, also unlike a smaller torpedo bomber, if you'd missed your intended target, you can go back in and have another go, or if you hit your intended target, you can pick another target and go after that one as well. So that actually makes them quite effective. The Wellingtons apparently did it very, very well in a night torpedo bomber role, going after Italian convoys. And in that respect, actually, their sheer size did give them a few advantages because, of course, they're very stable flight platforms, and with additional crew to help with night navigation, that actually made them slightly more useful than a smaller single-engine craft would be in the same role. And that's it for this week. This one's gone on a little bit longer than normal, but as you might detect towards the end of this recording, I have been suffering from a bit of a head cold, so forgive me for that. But in any case, thanks very much for listening. See you again in another video.